Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I am honored to present at what has been an incredibly stimulating conference. Thank you for inviting me. I hope to contribute to this impressive array of papers and ideas. Our discussion today will center on the study of the quotidian interactions, sites of exchange, and reimagined cityscapes of pre- and post-conquest Granada in 16th century Iberian chapbooks. I might note that I am no historian, so I will take a lot from previously presented papers and the rich historical context that we have uncovered in this conference. I am in the preliminary stages of a project on Iberian chapbooks, which will hopefully lead towards an academic book. So any feedback and comments will be greatly appreciated. Before anything, it seems necessary to, here we go. To note two things about Iberian chapbooks. First, while not popular in Iberian literary studies and criticism, these small, brief, inexpensive texts were quite prevalent in 16th century Iberian literary landscape. For starters, they were dually accessible to people. On the one hand, they were often reclaimed aloud in public spaces, and they had a big oral audience, proving beneficial to communities that did not necessarily know how to read, as explained by Maria Sanchez Perez. On the other, they were economical, brief, quotable, which benefited the accessibility of readers. The production of pliegos sueltos provided 16th century readerships and hearing audiences access to literature and inexpensive printed materials. The second observation that is important to note is that the representation of space in the pliegos, especially in those with a chorographical intent, is quite fascinating, and several of them try to mimic as closely but as idealistically as possible their surrounding and spatialities. With these ideas in mind, we will analyze disputed territories, dynamics of intolerance, repurposed architectures, and how these aspects produce a new understanding of space where diversity is often expunged and negated into pliegos sueltos of the 16th century. And I selected two because I don't have a space for more, but I would also not like to give the impression of an homogeneous representation, Christian representation of other religious groups. So two is the case for us. Far from homogeneous, ethno-religious interactions, these chapbooks, ethno-religious interactions will explore the, quote, fundamental interdependence of violence and tolerance fashioned by Nuremberg. Often, 16th century chapbooks publish gloss versions of 15th century medieval oral ballads or romances. As an example of this practice is the gloss version of the Romance del Tornadizo y la Virgen, which narrates the journey of a Moorish king and a massive cavalry of 300 men from Granada to Almeria. During the expedition, a conversation about love and courtship is interrupted by a renegade who regrets his conversion to Islam and decides to reconvert. Through the study of these chapbooks, we will get a glimpse into the attitudes and penalties towards the population of religious renegades in Muslim Iberia and Granada. The amusing tale takes place in the frontier landscape. Described by the glossator Alonso de Alcapdete as incredibly dangerous. En el tiempo que esta tierra estaba más peligrosa, cuando por lo llano y tierra no faltaba jamás guerra. According to the text, war was simply part of the quotidian interactions between Moors and Christians in medieval Andalusia. In this besiege, close to being conquered Almeria, finally occupied in 1490, the Moorish soldiers were predisposed for battle, todos escaramuzando con sus lanzas muy polidas. What remains unclear is if the Tornadizo joined forces with this Muslim cavalry and aided them in their battles against the Christian enemy, or if he was there only in other sort of capability, like a servant perhaps. In the former scenario, the problematic figure of the renegade will have not only been a religious traitor, but also a political one. This interesting protagonist, the renegade or tornadizo, is undoubtedly a critical component in this site of conflict and the religious animosity. Renegading was quite an ordinary practice at the time and a prevalent topic in the romancero. For instance, in many romances, the mention of a despicable or ambiguous character will often be accompanied by the epithet hijo de la renegada, son of the renegade, like in the Romance del Maestre de Calatrava and the Romance de los Infantes de Lara. Other examples include the Romance de Bobadillas el Pagano, which tells the story of a renegade that changed his beliefs 8 times. Medieval balladry in Iberia was definitely concerned with narrating the border, its encounters and conquests, and the dynamics of religious difference, acculturation, and lack thereof. Arguably, converting was a pragmatic way to navigate hybrid society in terms of religion. According to Ana Echevarria, Christian conversions to Islam in the 15th century were in the first place due to true conviction about their new faith. However, quote, there could also be a desire to avoid taxes, particularly in the case of conversion to Islam, where the new Muslim immediately stopped paying a poll tax, end quote. Since the renegade regrets his conversion to Islam, a monetary reason seems more fitting to his case. So we go back to the fiscal violence explained yesterday by Theo. Here, the financial benefits of conversion call for pragmatism on the part of Christians who decided to convert to avoid certain poll taxes, not because of a true conviction. Undoubtedly, this individual lived in an existence in an ever-changing political, religious, and ethnic frontier. In this zone of cultural conflict, the renegade serves a foreign territory, king, and religion. The infamous Tornadizo regrets his conversion to Islam by praising and declaring his love for the Virgin Mary, yet another Marian conversion, as in Paula Tentakov thought. The Muslim king instantly and without hesitation decides to incarcerate him in Almeria. However, interestingly, the dynamics between the renegade and the Moorish cavalry were quite tense and violent since the beginning of the narration. Even before learning about the renegade's conversion, the cavalry distrusted and slandered him. Aquella falsa canalla. Also, before declaring his conversion, the renegade determined it appropriate to plead for his life in advance. Si mantienes esta ley, yo te la daré, Juan Rey, si me otorgas la vida. These circumstances showcase a divergent member of society that must behave cautiously around his peers. First, he was not deemed trustworthy, and second, he was terrified for his life. The treatment of the Tornadizo exposed the disapproval and animosity towards the renegade community in 15th century Iberia. Furthermore, from how the cavalry mistreated the renegade to how he implored for his life before converting, we should assume that this confession, rather than costing his liberty, could have cost him his life. While religious conversions were common in 15th century Iberia, they seem to have been highly discouraged and not without punishment. In regards to the topic, Matthew Carr elucidates on the quite violent treatment and penalties against Christian converts to Islam in the late 15th century. To Christians and Muslims alike, I'm quoting, Anyone who abandoned his or her faith for another was an apostate. And the attitude of Christians toward these renegados was illustrated by a horrific incident following the siege of Malaga in 1487, when a group of Christian converts to Islam were tied as stakes and killed with cane spears in a cruel variant of the jousting competition known as the Juego de Cañas. In theory, the Granadan Elches, meaning the Christian converts to Islam, were protected from such treatment by a specific clauses in the capitulations, which stipulated that converts who have become Moors will not be forced to return to Christianity against their will. However, these policies were abolished in practice, and Christian converts to Islam were often persecuted and pressured to return to Christianity. So both Christian and Muslim converts alike endured persecution. The non-assimilation of the Tornadizo confirms the hybridity of these geographic, political, and religious boundaries. The renegade practiced a space of religious intolerance that did not have room for conversions or changes of heart. In the Romance del Tornadizo y la Virgen and Esclosa, the interspace between Granada and Almería, a few years before the conquest of Granada, is conditioned by warfare and religious conflict. The 16th-century appraisal of that medieval romance is quite revealing. The medieval romance is reassessed from the perspective of the 16th-century crusader. Initially, the ballad merely sing about the interactions of the Granada-Almería frontier. However, the gloss version of the romance praises the glorious conversion of the renegade and gives legitimacy to the Christian conquest. Debajo de su seguro, muy sobrado esfuerzo cobra, teniendo fuerte su muro, como cristiano muy puro, puso su deseo en obra de divina gracia lleno. The renegade repented, and as a prodigal son, returned to the ranks of Christianity. In this revised version of the medieval ballad, the renegade is heightened to a saint degree. His piety praised as cristiano muy puro, de divina gracia lleno. The Romance del Tornadizo y la Virgen represents the religious hybridity of 15th-century Andalusia, while Esclosa reivindicates the renegade's decision. More than an apostate, the Tornadizo is now a token of a truly glorified religious conversion. That I may add is at the same time a pro-Christian and almost with a propagandistic purpose. In the second portion of this talk, I will discuss a unique 16th-century chapbook that showcases a textual map of 1550 post-conquest Granada. In this interesting text, the reader-traveler is prompted to visit the Andalusian city using the chapbook as a guide or map. Diré por dónde habéis de entrar. Presumably, those who got their hands on the chapbook or heard it performed in the street will have noticed the current state of affairs in coveted Granada, porque el que viniera a verla haya todo lo que dijo. The chapbook insists on the representation of a renewed post-conquest and Christian Granada. To do so, the chapbook of the Partidas offers a logical itinerary through the main streets of Granada, which features a long list of churches and convents, 31 in total. The medieval mosques are now available to the Christian community as Catholic cathedrals, y a la iglesia mayor que otro tiempo fue mezquita, donde la gente maldita adoraba al Santarrón. Moreover, quotidian religious activities such as attending the liturgical hours substitute Muslim prayer. Like other churches in Andalusia, the 16th-century cathedral, nowadays the Catedral Metropolitana de la Encarnación, was built on top of Granada's main mosque. These repurposed buildings impose a new understanding of Granada. The places where Muslim community perform their religious activities now cater to the Christian community. Granadan architecture is renewed and with it, the native Muslim communities erased, at least from the structural layer of the city. The chapbook is probably referring to the urban policy of affirmation of the new power established by the crown right after the conquest of Granada. These were a set of policies to reinvigorate Granada by instituting new plazas, building churches, building mosques, or turning pre-existing mosques into churches. They had as their goal appropriating space and ridding it of any Muslim remains. These structural changes were to redefine the cityscape after conquest. Katie Holmes ponders on the new architectural and social conditions imposed on the Muslim community in Granada. Over the course of the century, the city's new rulers forced the indigenous community to abandon its faith and customs, becoming Moriscos or Catholic converts from Islam. At the same time, settlers from throughout the Iberian Peninsula flocked to Granada, drawn by the economic and social opportunities it afforded. End quote. The chapbook of the Partidas provides historiographical insights into this reconstruction project. It supports, as many photographical materials did in the late 16th and 17th centuries, a new understanding of the cityscape of Granada. Peace in Granada is legitimized through the reconstruction of medieval mosques, but also through the institutional repression exerted by the Inquisition. This form of institutional violence, accurately defined by Teófilo Ruiz as, quote, encompassing actions more or less sanctioned by law that those in power took against their subjects and vassals, end quote. On this matter, the chapbook maps and contextualizes the place close to Plaza Nueva where the autos de fe took place. Y prosiguiendo mi tema, por del auto de la quema do condenan los infieles. The tribunal of the Inquisition was established in 1499 in Granada, with its first public auto de fe in 1526, the second in 1530, and the third in 1549. Therefore, we may understand this reference to the Inquisition in Granada as a form of institutional repression that was currently active. Furthermore, the chapbook's support of these forms of institutional violence are confirmed a few lines onwards, where the text reaffirmed the role of the Inquisition in abetting Christianity and bringing the parationals towards the light. This literary representation of 1550s Granada illustrates the systemic persecution of non-assimilated Moriscos. Other forms of institutional violence evident in the Partidas took the form of territorial displacement and social exclusion. For instance, parts of the journey through Granada are highlighted for the lack of a Morisco presence, sin topar ningún Morisco. The architectural remodeling and institutional violence are thus accompanied by a social and spatial cleansing in which a possible traveler might walk through a sector of Granada, Pulchero Street, without encountering Moriscos. Furthermore, the Morisco communities endured demographic segregation. Y subid al alacín donde están hasta la fin los moriscos apartados, muy subidos y apretados. In the Partidas, the Moorish community seems to be living at the end of the hills of the Albaicín. They are segregated from the rest of the population and living in cramped, overcrowded conditions. The displaced Morisco community in Granada is restricted to a specific sector of the city. The Christian-dominated map delimited and charted the space to be practiced by Moriscos. They are not allowed to live in certain quarters and not expected to move through others. After the conquest of Granada, the Muslim community was expected to have freedom of faith. However, by the end of the 15th century, the Muslims were pressured to convert. The first rebellion of the Alpujarras took place in 1499 as a consequence. After this event, the crown placed much more pressure on the conversions. They feared an enemy within who could insidiously assist Berber corsairs and Ottoman attackers. Teófilo Ruiz clarifies that Moriscos, after the forced conversions of Muslims in 1504, were very reluctant to accept to accept Christians' ways of life. Therefore, they were perceived as a fifth column, ready to join invaders and give information to the enemy. Once the Inquisition campaign against Judaizers began to run out of steam in the 1520s and 30s, the Holy Office began to pay closer attention to these Moriscos. End of quote. The constant threat of subversion and doubtful conversions created political instability in early 16th century Granada. On the one side, Christians were constantly preparing for possible future attacks. Guárdala 3,000 soldados porque esté mejor que de antes. Also, they delimited and enforced an unbearable and constrictive space for the Morisco community. Consequently, Moriscos lived under harsh conditions where both their public and private spaces were restricted and charted, and the inquisitorial activities against them intensified. The punitive conditions against ethno-religious differences and the increasing institutional repression resulted in the violent and second Morisco uprising in the Alpujarras in 1568. In the text of the Partidas, the cityscape of post-conquest Granada is noticeably renewed. Novas plazas, revamped cathedrals, reconstructed city walls, and new Christian sacred spaces were founded to purify Granada from its Muslim past and declare the hegemony of its new Christian community. At the same time, through the almighty presence of the Inquisition in the city and the limitation and restriction of the Muslim quarters, we are witnesses to the institutional repression placed on a community that is not fully assimilating to Christianity. The paper explored types of exchange and issues of religious hybridity and ethno-religious interaction in pre- and post-conquest Granada. On the one hand, the gloss romance depicted a dangerous Granada that was violent toward its renegade population. On the other, choreographic texts like the Partidas represent a reconstructed and powerful Granada, mejor que de antes, that similarly persecutes its convert population. When studying these literary representations of historical communities and spaces, it is essential to reflect on the interactions between referent and its representation. Does a space influence its literary representation, or on the contrary, does literature and how it portrays place impose into our understanding of space? Referentiality, a concept on geocriticism as a method to understand the fictionalization of reality through literature, explains how the interaction and influence of literature in the real world explores how the text and the world could merge to offer different representations of a particular space. Therefore, while we may see in these discussed chapbooks representations of the political, social, and religious dynamics in the transition from medieval to early modern Iberia, we should also understand these unassuming texts as printed testimonies of the institutional repression of the 16th century. These small popular texts provided ways to model behavior, adjust expectations, and understand space. Did the audience of these pamphlets, those who read or heard them in public squares, found in these brief pages a fictional representation of their world, or on the contrary, did the fictional words represented in the pliegos provided them with tools to understand the social, political, and religious environments? In 1550s, communities of non-assimilated Moriscos were being persecuted, condemned, and judged before the tribunals of the Inquisition, while chapbooks like the Partidas were publicly broadcasted in the same plazas where the autos de fe took place. It is worth noting that from different perspectives, both the gloss romance and the text of the Partidas point to a society confused and wrong about its religious identity. The renegade could not decide between being a Christian, a Moor, and then a Christian again, while the Muslim community in Granada were similarly institutionally persecuted. Through the chapbooks, we were able to explore an important shift in regard to the persecuted communities in Granada, which were Christian at one point and Muslim at the other. However, the analysis of both chapbooks pointed toward the problem of non-assimilation in a geopolitical region where the ethno-religious interactions were in constant flux. Thank you.